It happened again, didn't it? You went out to the party, you saw somebody that captured your imagination across the room, you wanted to go up and introduce yourself to them, make that connection, but you just couldn't do it, could you? Your feet seemed to be rooted in place. You tried to work up the courage to do it, maybe even told yourself nothing bad's gonna happen, but for some reason, you're just frozen, you're paralyzed, you couldn't make yourself go do it. And then what happened? Maybe they left. They left the party, they walked out of your life, and that connection was never made. You had approach anxiety. Look, meeting new people can be a pretty frightening task for a lot of individuals as it triggers anxiety that leads to avoidance behaviors. Now, these avoidance behaviors, they're learned and reinforced when they successfully help you avoid things that make you anxious. And this habit eventually becomes a reflex that can really affect the quality of life for you if you have this anxiety disorder. So to get rid of anxiety when you're meeting new people, it's first crucial to understand what's going on. What are the underlying emotional responses that cause this so-called approach anxiety? And that's basically the first step. The first step is awareness, without shame, without guilt, because that's kind of what led to a lot of this in the first place. But once you develop that awareness, there are then a lot of ways to then alleviate that anxiety and alleviate those symptoms by creating new conditioned responses that ultimately result in no response at all when you're in that situation. So first off, let's define what anxiety actually is. What does that word mean? Well, when people have anxiety disorders, basically they might try to avoid things that make them anxious. And this is something that happens partly because of natural emotional responses, but also because you learn to do it. It's a learned behavior. When you successfully avoid those things that make you anxious, you feel better. And then this reinforces the behavior. So for example, you're out at that party, you want to go talk to the people, that nervousness comes in, you start to think about their potential reactions, the potential humiliation or embarrassment, the uncertainty with how they're going to react. And of course, we generally tend to think negatively in terms of outcomes due to negative social conditioning. There's a lot of factors at play. That's kind of the topic of a separate video that I'll probably do later. But basically, when you just avoid the situation entirely, you avoid all those negative feelings. And this, of course, then reinforces the behavior. As a result, you start to avoid those things habitually, like a reflex. Whenever you're in that situation, boom, you just snap right to that avoidance mechanism. You snap right into that so-called approach anxiety. However, unlike natural responses to danger, the things that you're avoiding in this situation might not be dangerous in and of themselves. In other words, the so-called danger in a social situation is somewhat arbitrarily related to reality. So if I throw a brick at you, at your head, and you instinctively avoid the brick, that's an avoidance behavior that's going to save you from a lot of pain, a lot of physical, like an actually painful experience. However, if you avoid introducing yourself to that person that you want to make that connection with, you're actually putting yourself into a more painful situation. Logically, you know this. And I'd argue that the cumulative sense of powerlessness that comes from being controlled by that fear over time is actually far more frightening than pushing through those fears. And the only way to do that is to do the thing that you fear. And once you do that, the fear is very often exposed for the illusion that it is. We had a saying back in the day, fear is false evidence that appears real. But again, that's neither here nor there. Ultimately, with avoidance, your brain has learned some kind of response that can be performed in the presence of a learned trigger that short circuits the innate response. So for example, in experiments with rats, initially rats will freeze when they hear a sound that predicts a shock, right? And over time, they might learn, to say, jump up at just the right time during the sound to avoid the shock, or to maybe, push a button that will stop the shock from happening. These responses are performed automatically without conscious decision. They become habitual ways of automatically responding to those stimuli that are warning them of the danger. They're like, here's the situation where the shock's about to happen. Boom, automatically respond to again, head it off at the pass. So these emotional habits can actually be quite useful from a biological standpoint, from an evolutionary biology standpoint. You know, if you find out that going to a certain water hole is likely to put you face to face with a predator, like, you know, there's alligators in that watering hole, you might stop going to that water hole, right? That's a healthy avoidance behavior. But if you stop going to water holes at all because you become anxious whenever you start to look for water, well, now your avoidance response has become detrimental to your actual life. You now have an anxiety disorder. Congratulations. Now, a lot of the drugs to treat anxiety have been developed because of their efficiency in reducing avoidance behavior in animals. So, for example, if a rat is shocked when it steps off a platform in a test chamber, then it'll stay on the platform when it's put in the chamber the next day. However, if the rat gets a shot of Valium before it's being placed on the platform the next day, it's going to be actually much more likely to just step off the platform and figure out if the danger still exists. It's like, hey, fuck it. Let's see. I just don't care. I'm not saying you should take Valium, but it's an interesting aspect of how fear conditioning works in the brain. So this avoidance learning, it actually happens in two stages. First, the fear conditioning occurs. Then the response is learned. Why? Because it supposedly reduces the learned fear. Basically, anything that reduces your exposure to fear eliciting events can become an avoidance response. Hence, not approaching someone when you actually want to. So what do we do about all this? Now, the aim of psychoanalysis ultimately is to assist patients in understanding the roots of their internal conflicts and create congruence, right? That's a major aim of therapy. It's considered a healthy behavior. Now, in contrast with, say, cognitive behavioral therapy, they'll actually look to try to get rid of anxiety symptoms by employing various forms of what's called extinction therapy. And this approach gradually exposes you to increasingly frightening situations, like increasingly frightening iterations of the same situation, until a new conditioned response is created, resulting in no response at all. So how does this work? Well, extinction occurs in the amygdala via what's called synaptic plasticity, which is basically the same mechanism used in the initial conditioning. So what extinction therapy does is it strengthens those synaptic pathways that regulate the amygdala, which is where your emotional memories are very, very firmly stored. If you want to get more deep on this, you could check out a book by Francis Ledoux called The Emotional Brain. But again, to the best of our understanding, those emotional memories in the amygdala are very indelibly burned into the circuits. Once a fear trigger has been installed, you cannot get rid of it. It's there forever. The best that we can do is try to regulate their expression and kind of change the relationship and cool that trigger off. And the way that we do this is by getting the cortex, the forebrain, to control the amygdala. Basically, it's a form of implicit learning involving the prefrontal amygdala circuit. So it's very, very well known in neuroscience circles that the connections from the forebrain down to the amygdala are far weaker than the connections from the amygdala up to the cortex. So this might explain why it's so easy for emotional information to sort of invade and overwhelm our conscious thoughts, but it's quite difficult for us to gain conscious control over our emotions. So reducing our fear, reducing our anxiety, it might be such a difficult process because of this asymmetry in connections between the cortex and the amygdala. So our ability to rapidly form memories of situations associated with danger and again, burn them in and hold on to them for long periods of time, essentially for life, and then use them automatically when similar situations present themselves in the future, this is actually a great tool. This is one of our brain's most powerful and efficient learning and memory functions, but it's kind of not the best in some other ways, right? It's sort of counterproductive in some other ways. Because why? Sometimes we develop these fears and anxieties about things that we might just as well not have. Like, what's so useful about being afraid of approaching somebody? It's like, yes, while there might be some risk of like slight embarrassment involved with it, the chances of it actually causing you harm are negligible. Like the chances of it actually causing a marked and quantifiable negative impact on your day-to-day life is negligible. But, you know, your emotions are telling you different. So again, at this point, it might behoove us to explore what are emotions. Well, what is so unique about these states, these special states of consciousness, that we book them and categorize them into this thing we call emotions? Well, emotional feelings result when, number one, we become consciously aware that an emotion system in the brain, like, for example, the defense system, becomes active. And for this to occur, we need two things. Number one, we need a defense system of some sort to be triggered. And then number two, we need to have the capacity to be consciously aware of that defense system's activity in the brain. So ultimately, understanding emotional experiences, it's not a problem about emotion. It's actually a problem about how conscious experiences actually occur in our brain. So what is consciousness? Well, our present conscious experience is dependent on your so-called working memory, right? Your cognitive working space. And what that is, it's a temporary storage system that we use in pretty much all active thinking processes. And while the amount of information that can be held in that general workspace is limited, I think that the conventional wisdom is you can hold 7 pieces of information in your cognitive working space at one time. So it's pretty limited. However, it can contain various types of information that might be interrelated. So for example, the way something looks, the way something sounds, the way something smells can be associated with its name in the working memory. So the information basically in your working memory is the stuff that you're currently thinking about and paying attention to. However, working memory is not a pure product of the here and of right here and right now. It depends also on long-term memory. So, for example, to be aware that you're looking at a blender bottle, it's not enough for this bottle to be, represented as a purely visual pattern in my brain by my visual system. It's only when that visual pattern matches up with information in my long-term memory does the visual stimulus of this light coming into my eyes get recognized as blender bottle. So even the fleeting present moment that you experience involves your memory. Like what we know about this one present moment that you're experiencing right now is basically what is in your working memory. Working memory allows you to know that the here and now is here and is happening now. So ultimately, to wrap all that up, consciousness is the awareness of what is in your working memory. So the two aspects of your thought, both conscious thought and unconscious thought, might be referred to or thought of as serial and parallel functions. So what do I mean by that? Well, the conscious mind tends to focus on one task at a time in a serial manner, while the unconscious mind operates with many different systems happening simultaneously below your awareness. So the conscious mind can be viewed as a limited capacity processor that sits on top of a hierarchy of specialized lower processors that are operating in parallel. Symbol manipulation is the realm of that serial processor, and it's only through symbolic representation that we actually become aware of information. Those lower level parallel processes, they handle information processing in a sub-symbolic manner using, I guess what you might call a variety of codes that are not consciously decipherable to us. So emotional feelings result when we become consciously aware that one of those lower emotional systems of the brain is active. So any animal, any creature that has consciousness also has feelings. However, feelings are going to be experienced differently in a brain that can actually classify the world linguistically and categorize those experiences in words than in the brain that cannot do that. So for example, the distinction between fear and anxiety, terror, and mild apprehension, those distinctions would not exist without language. However, the existence of these linguistic labels is meaningless without the underlying emotional system that generates the bodily responses and the corresponding brain states that they actually refer to. And these bodily responses, these brain states, are actually the core components of an emotion, while conscious feelings are secondary. In other words, they're sort of the icing on the cake of emotions. So to sum all this up, if you want to get rid of approach anxiety when you're out meeting new people, it's very, very possible, but it requires you to understand and act on a couple of things. Number one, it requires you to develop an awareness of when you are about to become emotional. For example, you're out, you say, okay, the stimuli are present that will typically cause me to go into that anxiety state. I have that awareness, and now I can take action and train an incompatible behavior before that state takes hold. Because once you're in the grip of it, you're in that emotional episode's refractory period, so to speak, it can hijack your forebrain, as we just said, and it'll actually prevent you from processing information that would contradict that state. You can tell yourself, oh, it doesn't matter, it's no big deal, nothing's going to happen, as much as you want, but once you're in the physical grip of it, you're just not going to be able to take action. So you got to get to that point where you see, okay, the stimuli are present where I typically go into that. Now I can train that incompatible behavior. And again, remember, behavior therapy can also be, elements from that behavioral therapy can also be employed to alleviate anxiety symptoms by creating new conditioned responses that ultimately result in you having no response at all in that situation. You cool off those hot triggers via extinction therapy, which, remember, strengthens the synaptic pathways that regulate the amygdala, and that's crucial in regulating those emotional responses and cooling off those hot triggers so they don't grab you. You're not at the mercy of them when you go out. If you've got to approach anxiety, it's very possible using these techniques to overcome that anxiety and experience a much better quality of life by applying these methods. So if you struggle with anxiety when you're out meeting new people and you want to learn how to, boom, just go up and make powerful social connections with people pretty much instantaneously, come on my mentoring program. Join me on my bootcamp program. I've been running these programs very, very successfully for literally 20 years. My first programs were in 2003. So with the expertise and guidance from myself and my coaches, you're gonna learn how to get rid of that anxiety. You're gonna develop core confidence. You're gonna become charismatic in pretty much any social situation that you can imagine. Because we're gonna give you valuable tools, we're gonna give you all kinds of strategies so you can make meaningful connections and build lasting relationships. Don't let anxiety hold you back from living your best life. Click the link in the description here, join the mentoring program today, join the bootcamp today, and start your journey towards social success. This has been Jeffy, and I'll see you next time.